morning, everyone. Before coming here, I was at Bloomberg at 7 a.m. this morning writing about ITV's latest financial results. And as you'd imagine, Brexit is very much on the brain for them. So it's great to be here to continue talking about that theme. By way of context, the UK is in the middle of its greatest constitutional crisis since the Second World War, as it tries to extract itself from its largest trading partner, a market of 500 million consumers. So the question is, what is the impact for this industry, the media and broadcast sector? There are basically two schools of thought. One school of thought is that there's really not much to worry about, and indeed Brexit presents opportunities for this sector. But indeed there's another school of thought which says that no, this is really quite serious, and indeed it could be a blow which imperils the long-term success of this industry. So, which school of thought is correct? That's what we're here to discuss. So please welcome our panel. We have from Pact, Dawn McCarthy-Simpson. From the law firm Reed Smith, we have Ingrid Silver. And from the Association for International Broadcasters, Simon Spanswick. So, thank you all for joining us. Do you want to kick us off? What are the key issues at stake? Before we get on to the impacts long term, the opportunities and so on, just set out for us, what are the issues for this sector when it comes to Brexit?
Well, we've talked about this for 2 years and the issues are still pretty much the same. Freedom of movement is by far our biggest concern with Brexit. And then there's a couple of others, but no one knows what Brexit is. I mean, we sit here, we debate the same things, but until it happens, we're not really sure what it's going to look like or where the impact's going to be. I think having gone through the process of lots of review, we do feel that we're in a sort of mode now where we're just getting on with it. So we're doing a lot more activity with Europe and trying to reassure our members. We've got 550 companies across the UK. What we don't want to do is keep talking about the problems and where the issues are. We want to try and just say, look, let's just get on with it.
So just briefly on freedom of movement, that's the issue of being able to bring in talent, bring in directors from the EU. How important is that at the moment for...
Well, I think, any UK company is pretty much a global company. And by being global, you need to embrace different cultures. You need to film in different regions, different territories. And I think it's always been really important. I know DCMS brought out a report, I think in 2017, that the production sector is made up of 6.5% of people in Europe in the production sector, and 5.5% outside of Europe. So, if you're talking about 10% of our workforce is made up outside of the UK, that's quite a big concern, because if that restriction comes in, then where do we source, new talent? And I think because we're in very much a freelance industry, it's hard to secure. I mean, I've just been through, we sponsored somebody from China to come and work with us. It wasn't an easy process, it was quite a difficult process. But if I was to recruit somebody from Europe at the moment, they could just come in, set up and work out the office. So if we've suddenly got to go through that process, and there's very few full-time positions, so we rely on short contracts, freelancing. You're not going to be able to do that in a the traditional sponsored role type side.
So that's the production element. Ingrid, talk to us about, for broadcasters, what's at stake there?
Well, I don't want to steal Simon's thunder. I'm sort of sandwiched between production here and broadcasters here. But just to sort of reaffirm what Dawn has said, from day one, from the referendum, there have been two fundamental issues for the media sector, both for the production sector and broadcasters. One is freedom of movement, which we've just touched on. And I would just add to that it's not just about freedom of movement for people to come here and support the production sector here, but it's this country's ability to go into Europe for co-production, short-term projects and so on. So it is a two-way thing. The other key issue is around country of origin. So that is the ability for broadcasters to be established in one particular member state, be licensed by the regulator of that member state, and be able to broadcast throughout the rest of the EU. And as we all know, Ofcom has been one of the by far the greatest licensor of media services in Europe, which has made the UK a big hub for the broadcast sector in terms of establishment, but also the whole ecosystem that gravitates around that. I guess the other slightly subsidiary issue, but which I think is on people's minds, is the definition of European works, and the fact that under the regulatory regime, which is originally TV Without Frontiers, AVMS directive, which has recently been revised, there are quotas which have been strengthened under the new directive for European content. And the definition of European content, European works, is actually derived from the convention, Council of Europe Convention, which goes far beyond the EU. Post-Brexit, this country will still be a signatory to that convention and in theory qualify under those quotas. So that should remain untouched, but I think there's a niggling anxiety, shall we say, within the broadcast and media and production community that somehow the EU could adjust that definition so that the UK falls out of it. So, but fundamentally, it is about freedom of movement and country of origin. Would you agree with that?
I think you've hit the nail on the head.
Simon, I know that you are perhaps more of an optimist on the Brexit issues. Play devil's advocate for me and tell me, what's the worst case scenario on Brexit? Freedom of movement, European works, the licensing issue. What do you advise companies say? This is the worst case. Here's what could really happen.
It depends which sector you're in, whether you're in production or whether you're a broadcaster. I think my colleagues here have hit two nails on the head. Freedom of movement is very important. And it seems that the government is working towards trying to find a solution to that. We're in the situation, we don't know where we are. We thought we'd know a few weeks ago. We don't know whether we're going to know this week, next week, 2 years down the road. So it's creating this level of uncertainty around what happens with things like freedom of movement and about the licensing of channels. We've been involved in looking at the impact of the regulatory regime since the day of the referendum and have been talking to regulators across Europe to find out what their position is, what they're trying to do. A lot of European regulators have been doing roadshows here in the UK to try and attract broadcasters to say, we're the best place to come and cite your licenses if the UK leaves Europe. You mentioned the Transfrontier Television Directive that the Council of Europe signs, the Council of Europe produced, which all but 7 nations in the EU 28 have signed, which carries forward freedom to broadcast into all but those 7 countries that haven't ratified it. That include the countries that haven't ratified it include Belgium, Ireland, Sweden, 1 or 2 others. Netherlands, yeah. Which are reasonably big markets for some of the channels that have been established here for a long time. So we're seeing bigger organisations like Discovery, like Turner, hedge their bets and get new licences. Turner for their German services in Munich through the Bavarian regulator. Discovery going into Amsterdam where they've got a presence. So big companies are coming up with solutions. Smaller companies, and there are a lot of broadcasters that are very small operations in this country, are looking at it and wondering what the hell they do, and the level of uncertainty has not helped them to create a plan.
And what would you say in terms of preparations that have been made? I mean, for the Discovery case of moving some licenses to the Netherlands, didn't move that many people, right? Only moving the EU headquarters to the Netherlands, nothing much to worry about. Is that fair?
I think if you're a company the scale of Discovery, no, because they've got a presence there, moving a handful of people to fulfil the roles that the license requires in the Netherlands is not a difficult operation.
is this
kind of the thin end of the wedge by which, in 5 years' time, Discovery will look at its operations and say, why do we have this London office and the Netherlands office? Why don't we just consolidate it all in one place, and why not make that the Netherlands? Ingrid, what do you think?
Well, I think that's the wider existential question here, because if you look at the sort of practicalities, in a way you can treat the challenge of dealing with country of origin as one of those known unknowns. So even if we don't know what Brexit will look like, you can already understand what the regulatory regime is and take proactive steps to decide where you want to be established and where you want to be licensed. The wider question is, as you say, is this the thinner end of the wedge? So if people take concrete steps, and just to come back to that, I've seen the full spectrum. So, the Discovery, Move, Turner and so on have all been very high profile. And it's fair to say that a large contingent of broadcasters who haven't pulled the trigger, and it turns out that was probably quite smart given where we are, have some sort of contingency plan in place. And then there are others who, either because they are completely overwhelmed and don't know how to engage with the process, or because they took quite a sanguine view that actually, let's just wait and see, have done nothing. So there is a full spectrum. We haven't seen this mass exodus or anything like that, and it would be interesting to hear from Ofcom as to what they're seeing in terms of movement of licenses and so on. But the wider question is, over the longer term, as people gravitate towards other centres, and we have seen a range of EU regulators, quite surprising ones really, come here and basically, set up stall to say, come to us, we'll be great. Will certain regulators and centres emerge as real hubs going forward? And Amsterdam, I think, is emerging as a potential threat to the UK, in that, okay, so you've got Discovery, you've got infrastructure, you've got Netflix established there, and so does that lead to the wider ecosystem migrating there? Because I don't think it's just about the regulatory regime, otherwise everyone would be getting regulated in Estonia. It is about the wider environment, language, culture, ability to move key executives to a location and so on. And that's what we need to bear in mind as things unfold. Could I just make one point of clarification on the convention, because I think people can sometimes get confused about it. We've both talked about the convention, but in different contexts. One is the European quota point, and the other is the fact that as a treaty, it maps the regulatory regime within the EU around country of origin. It has 13 additional signatories, including countries like Turkey and Russia, so quite significant markets. But as Simon pointed out, it is missing 7 territories, of which some are quite key. The other thing to flag on that is that it doesn't cover video on demand. Mm-hmm. And as we know, that's becoming increasingly significant to the broadcast sector.
Tell us about production, Dawn, in terms of
preparations made so far. So it's very obvious for the broadcasters, you need to get a license in another EU member state so that you're safe for when Brexit occurs. If you're a producer, what can you do? What have you done so far?
Well, I mean, I think people are just holding back for festivals, so I don't think there's been this mass move to any particular territory. I've spoken to a few that have said, well, we've already just set up a satellite office over in Ireland or in France, or, so people are looking, but I think, it's a massive investment to just go and set up somewhere without actually really understanding what Brexit is. So we've tried to say to people, just hold off, you've still got time post-Brexit to make those decisions, but rather than, when productions usually, they're quite strapped for cash most of the time, why invest in something and move into a different territory when everything is unknown? So we've tried to kind of steer people away from making big decisions. Obviously, moving any broadcast system out of the UK is that's worrying to us, because you suddenly move a buyer from on the doorstep. It's that extra travel. It becomes then more of an international kind of partner. So that's been something we've been keeping an eye on, but as they've said, there hasn't been a massive sort of impact on that as well.
And our advice has been don't panic as well,
Yeah.
because nobody knows what's going to happen. And even when we leave, there should be a 6-month implementation or transition period. So there's still time for people to solve the issues. None of them are insurmountable. A lawyer may have a different view.
No,
Do you think something
we'd
like
agree.
Discovery
Regrets moving.
You'd have to ask
I think
Discovery
that's a
then.
good question.
They never answer my phone call.
I mean, there is one practical thing which people can do, and that is one thing we're advising our clients to do across the board, which is evaluate their current workforce and understand its composition and do a sort of historic evaluation as to staffing on projects and so on, and dependencies, just to understand those. And sometimes you can be pleasantly surprised, or you can support existing staff, because as we know, there are transitional arrangements for people who are already based here to be able to stay. So engaging with the data and understanding your position, I think, is one thing you can do, and it comes back to those known knowns versus known unknowns and dealing with that.
What kind of advice has the Department for Culture, Media and Sports been giving the sector? What do you hear? I mean, are they being helpful as civil servants, kind of giving lots of good guidance, or are they as perplexed as everyone else?
Well, from our point of view, it's more they've been consulting with us, not really advising us, so more kind of trying to understand how our business works. So even things like looking at visas, you know, we were asked, how long would you want a visa for to film in a territory? And I was like, well, how long's a piece of string? You know, if it's a series, a drama series, then completely different to a one-off documentary. So I find that there's no advice coming from them, more trying to understand how it works and then trying to make decisions from there.
That's certainly been our experience as well. They've come to us and asked for some holes to be filled in their knowledge because they hadn't been aware of the scale of the market in great detail, and they hadn't understood exactly how this works. Civil servants are not programme makers, they're not broadcasters. And there are some very good people at DCMS who have been listening very carefully to what we've been telling them and others have been telling them, so they can try and formulate a way forward and to help when and if we leave.
Case. I mean, they shouldn't go and make knee-jerk kind of trade deals and decisions without actually consulting with us. So I think they're doing the right process. They're really trying to understand every single part of the production process. So I think that's been interesting, but we haven't yet, you know, they haven't formulated any type of advice. I think we as a trade body have been left to kind of advise our members from our point of view.
If you look beyond sort of DCMS and the government bodies that are directly responsible for this sector, it seems to me there's a real disconnect in terms of getting the issues that are key to this sector on the political agenda. And so I'm in a global law firm which is full service, which means we specialise in media and entertainment, but we also specialise in other sectors. And it seems to me that there's a striking contrast between the focus there's been on things like the financial sector and the automotive sector, and their ability of those sectors to really get their issues right at the top of the political agenda and into the negotiating room in the context of Brexit negotiations as compared to this sector. And I'm not sure what that's attributable to, and I'd be interested to hear Simon and Dawn's views, but I wonder if it's because there's a perception in this country that media and entertainment is so strongly embedded in the ecosystem and so firmly established on the global world stage that it doesn't need the same support perhaps as other sectors, or a failure to appreciate the economic contribution of this sector to the country's economy. I'm not sure, but
I think it's also so from our point of view, how TV is sold. You know, it doesn't involve movement of goods necessarily. It doesn't, you know. So I think it's easier to trade with, and the UK is in the TV side is the second biggest exporter in the world. So we're well established. We're very global. You know, we're constantly trading. Within treaty, without treaty, you know, America is our biggest market. We have no trade deals there, and we trade very well there. So
let's do a bit of kind of a thought experiment here. So imagine Theresa May manages to pass her Brexit deal. She does some kind of deal with Labour. She gets enough support in the Commons. So then we have, exactly. So the UK is on course to leave the single market. It leaves, has a transition period. And then we start this new phase where we're negotiating a new relationship with the European Union. We try to get some kind of ambitious free trade deal with the EU. What does that then look like for the media sector, for both broadcasters and producers? How, as say, an American investor or an American company, do I think about the UK in that new scenario?
Shall I jump in?
Go ahead.
It's interesting because the issue we opened with was freedom of movement and country of origin, which is all about AVMS and TV Without Frontiers and all of that. But actually, what we're all forgetting as we sort of fixate on these issues and what's immediately in front of us is that at the moment there is a whole raft of regulation coming out of the EU as part of the digital single market package, which is intended to bring the EU within the digital age and support the sector in a way sort of what the presentation from Ofcom was talking about, supporting the sector and regulation. And so while we've all been sitting here fixating on Brexit and hard Brexit and everything that was happening in April, the copyright directive was passed. The revised CabSat directive was passed. So all these things around how digital copyright will be handled and how rights clearance will be handled for online content distribution, sort of massive regulatory developments which are dependent on reciprocity, regulatory reciprocity for us to benefit from them. People are forgetting about that because they are potentially falling outside of the transition period at the moment. So we're thinking, we won't have to deal with that, and so we'll just focus on everything else. But actually, you would really want them to be part of a longer-term arrangement as much as country of origin, freedom of movement, and so on. So I think it's important to us, for all of us at this point in time, to get to grips with the wider developments that are happening within the EU to bring the EU into the digital age. So for me, that would be quite important.
It is important to note that Ofcom is working very hard, continues to work on all these issues, and is negotiating to have an observer status in all the different committees that are being established in Europe. One of the things to remember is that Ofcom is by far the largest, most sophisticated regulator in any of the EU 28 member states.
Yes.
And the number of regulators that we've talked to that have said, well, if we've got a problem, we ring up Ofcom and they tell us how to solve it, which is great, but it shows that there isn't the intellectual capacity perhaps in a lot of these regulators that might have 5 or 6 people in. We talked to one regulator and I asked, Ofcom gets an awful lot of complaints about a lot of content that goes out. How will you deal with that? And they said, well, our viewers don't complain. We've had one complaint this year. And you think, well, hang on a minute. Have you actually looked at what Ofcom does and the broadcast bulletin that comes out, analysing some very complex issues that are raised by programming that is licensed by Ofcom? No one else is doing that to the same extent. So Ofcom still has a role to play. It may not have the same level of influence. And a lot of nations have said, we're going to miss the UK when you leave because you're our friend, you help us, you speak up for us because we share the same values.
And those are all incredibly valid points to make, and they go back to the sort of bigger picture of, there's going to be this gap in the short term where we don't really have a place at the table and can't influence the process in the same way and may have to sort of watch on feeling kind of depressed about how things are unfolding. And actually the copyright directive and all the debates around that and the value gap and all that sort of thing where really the UK didn't quite have the same influence anymore are a manifestation of that. But it reminds us of, well, what does the world look like 5-10 years from now unless we find a way to somehow embed ourselves in the regulatory framework and secure reciprocity and so on.
Audience, we're going to come to you with questions if you have any. So please do raise your hands and we'll do our best to throw with accuracy. Yes.
Where's this one? Yeah, lovely. Hello, David Cutts from Strategy and Technology, fervent Remainer, I'm afraid. All those things you just discussed now are very important. You know, the influence of Ofcom on European regulation in broadcasting, I think it's been substantial over some decades. I'm just thinking about some of the next things that are coming along. We're starting to see them, particularly competition regulation and structural regulation about global companies and their ability to deliver communication platforms of a new kind, or relatively new kind, into the European marketplace. Do you think that a Brexited UK will have enough economic power to perform regulatory actions on difficult companies, shall we say, compared to the economic power that the European Union has, the European Commission has, to regulate difficult companies in these emerging circumstances? I think we're already seeing new communication platforms controlled by individual companies taking the place of state monopoly communication regulators, and there's the economic control that the EU can bring to bear is much greater than that provided from the UK.
I think those are incredibly valid and important points to raise. We've already seen EU regulators be very assertive around data protection regulation and fines. And as you touched on, there is a whole exercise happening within the EU at the moment around re-evaluating the competition regulatory regime to be based not only on economic tripwires, if you like, which are around size of deals and monetary value, but around non-monetary factors and specifically sort of the number of eyeballs that you capture, which would give the regulatory authorities remit to review the transaction. I'm not sure if it's so much about the economic power to enforce decisions or a regulatory regime as much as a fear on the part of a regulator, which is that if you're too hostile to big players, they'll bypass you and go to markets and jurisdictions which make themselves more attractive to you. It's a bit like what we've seen with the broadcast regulators saying, come to us, we'll make life easy for you, and you can come and establish yourself here and tax, etc. So I think that is perhaps the insecurity and the anxiety on the part of a smaller regulator representing a smaller market, which will come into play. But really interesting question to pose.
More questions from the floor.
Right, you first.
Hi. How is the relationship between the UK's broadcasters and SES Astra going to work after Brexit? Because I'm sure from the whole history of it all, we use Luxembourg's transmission frequencies for all our satellite television, and you've obviously talked about broadcasting from the UK to other places, but how are we going to have a system where we have no direct relationship between us and Luxembourg after Brexit for the substantial majority of television consumption in the UK which is done from satellite?
Well, I think economics will trump everything else. SES wants the income. It's interesting, there are a number of channels that are licensed by the Luxembourg regulator that have no office in Europe, and they're using the secondary criteria of the satellite location of satellite uplink, and the Luxembourg has been reasonably keen to promote that as an opportunity. So I don't think there's going to be an issue, and space regulation, satellites are regulated under the ITU rather than the European Union. So I'm not sure there's going to be any change there or with Eutelsat out of France.
And actually, if you look at that's absolutely right. If you look at the establishment test, if you have no presence within the EU currently, then it's the satellite uplink and so on, which determines where you are established for regulatory purposes and therefore where you're licensed, which means that if you have a broadcaster which is currently established in the UK and licensed by Ofcom but has zero presence in the EU and is going out on Astra, technically post-Brexit, if there's no other country of origin arrangement, that that broadcaster will automatically fall under the regulatory regime of Luxembourg. So opportunity for Luxembourg and no real problem, I don't think, in terms of
The one problem for Luxembourg is
relationships.
hiring
People at the regulator who can regulate Arabic channels or channels in all these different languages, which are currently done by...
Well, once upon a time, Luxembourg was in fact a very attractive regulator for a number of broadcasters who, in theory, probably should have been licensed here, but elected to be in Luxembourg. So they have a long history of regulating quite a wide array of channels and broadcasters.
And they're very pragmatic.
Yes.
more questions from the floor.
Oh, am I going to get you over there? Good catch.
Just a quick observation, but firstly to commend you, Joe, for the restraint you've shown in not mentioning last night's result. Ingrid and Simon have touched upon this, but it just relates very much to the first presentation as well, where Yi was asked about the future of regulation. Because the future of regulation is very much tied up with the subject matter of this talk, namely Brexit. The revised AVMS directive will considerably broaden the scope of platforms that are in scope. Mm-hmm. It significantly broadens the existing definition of what is a VOD service, so that will immediately increase the number of services in scope. And for the first time, it will bring into scope video sharing platforms and social media sites, which again featured in the first presentation. So very interesting to see whether or not the UK will subscribe to those significant increases in regulation or not as part of the whole Brexit meltdown and compromise.
More questions?
For one more, I think.
Okay, yep, got it. If I could just ask the panel, just change of tack slightly. There are, as you probably agree, a number of reasons why large productions are attracted to produce in the UK, and why a number of co-productions are also attracted to the UK. And one of them, I believe, is the source of funding. And EU money at the moment makes it attractive for such things as Game of Thrones to have been made in Ireland. With Brexit, what do you think the risks are and the likelihood that funding might influence large productions to not be as attracted to the UK as they are today?
Well, there is an option that, and we've spoken about this because the tax credits has obviously seen a massive increase in drama being produced in the UK, like Game of Thrones and other ones. But there is the option, thinking more on the positive side of Brexit, that currently it's sort of capped at 25% or net 20%, that we could increase that and become more competitive and actually attract more drama into the UK. And, you know, we've already got a global reputation of quality, skills is very high. So we usually trump on that anyway. So if we can then add and be more competitive with our European partners, then that could be to benefit us rather than disadvantage.
And I think if you're looking for the one opportunity presented by Brexit in all of this, it's the fact that the UK wouldn't be bound by the rules on state aid anymore, and therefore could inject capital into the sector.
And Starbucks is apparently going to make huge investment in drama now. I don't know how many people saw that.
Thank you very much.
In an episode of Game of Thrones just this week, the Starbucks cup was in shot. So, you know, product placement rules could be changed dramatically.
I did hear that HBO said that that was a mistake. She had asked for a mint tea, not a latte.
Guys, well, audience, thank you very much for your questions, and thank you. So, very briefly.
Oh my goodness.
One question.
Ready?
Hello, Ken Skarbrevik. I'm a Norwegian producer based over here, executive producer, etc. On a point of state aid and EU, I just want to make a point that the Norwegian government took the decision to give state aid to the suffering TV2, the equivalent of commercial broadcaster in UK, ITV. That was, according to the EU regulatives for EEA countries, not possible. And we're in a situation where actually Discovery have come in and said, you can't do this. You can't give money to a commercial broadcaster who is trying to develop more Norwegian content for Norwegian viewers. So I just want to make a point that if UK goes down the route of a Norway style, be aware of this.
So yeah, thanks again, audience, for your questions, and thank you very much to our panel for discussing all the issues.